Obama administration is better than the Bush administration in some of these areas. I'm thinking, for example, of Michelle Obama, who is supposed to be interested in organic farming and healthful living. If you see any glimmers of hope and ways we can reach the Obama administration.
That's a great question. I mean, Obama, as a senator, made some really important comments about all of this. I mean, he objected to one of these Senate hearings on eco-terrorism, saying it was diverting law enforcement resources and instilling fear. A lot of the same talking points, that I'm using this evening. Unfortunately, since he's taken office, we haven't seen any action on any of that. One of the communications management units is in his home state of Illinois. The first prosecutions under the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act were under his watch. Of course, we're seeing everything with the NSA spying and the war on Edward Snowden and WikiLeaks, and the list goes on and on. But, I like that emphatic but at the end of it. I think there is, I really shy away from using the word hope, but I think there's an incredible amount of potential to see what's taking place right now around the country. Even in that climate, there's a lot of incredible organizing going on. There's been a resurgence of the grassroots environmental movement, some really ambitious new ways of doing animal rights activism. There's been a focus on surveillance and ideas of transparency and secrecy like never before. So I see a lot of potential and hope in that. Perhaps not so much with people in power.
You may have been the only senator to vote against the Patriot Act. I was wondering if he voted against the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, or if you know if Tammy Baldwin, who's our local, was our local congressperson at that time, voted against, she's now a senator, or Cole, who was our senator.
The short answer to that is no, they didn't. The more complicated answer is that on the Senate side it passed by a voice vote, so technically no one opposed it. On the House side it passed through a procedure called suspension of the rules, which is kind of an obscure procedure that's used for non-controversial bills. For instance, that same week it was used to honor the guy who renamed a bridge, to rename a bridge in Delaware after the guy who invented the Roth IRA, and to honor the St. Louis Cardinals and some other sports teams. I mean, that's how this is supposed to be. So these bills are kind of coming down a conveyor belt, and you're just passing them super fast to get them out the door. Well, members on the House side found out that there was growing opposition to this law, so they used that procedure to pass a terrorism law. And there was technically no voice vote. I mean, there were only 6 members of Congress in the room at that time. No one spoke out. I mean, Dennis Kucinich raised some objections, but people often say he's the person who voted against it, and it's not true. Technically, no one did, because there wasn't a vote. I mean, it passed by unanimous consent under suspension of the rules. So not to offer too much explanation of that, but in other words, no one in Congress spoke out against this. Is anyone familiar with this term at all, grand juries? Heard a little bit. There are some that went on in Wisconsin back in the 90s, a few that are going on right now. Grand juries are, kind of the quick summary is, they're meant to be, in theory, a safeguard during prosecution, so that before a prosecution moves forward, a grand jury and panel of citizens evaluates evidence brought by the government to determine if there's enough to go forward with it. Now, when it comes to political cases, since the 60s and certainly since the Red Scare as well, grand juries have been used to investigate, surveil, and harass social movements. And the reason they're used in that way is that when you're called before a grand jury, you're going to a room that's secretive. You can't even have your attorney present. You have no First and Fourth and Fifth Amendment rights. If you're being asked questions, you have to answer them. And these questions are about, what do you believe? What do you know about this Will Potter guy who came to Madison? What do you know about Josh and everybody else here on campus? What do you think about that? What do you think about the Animal Liberation Front? All these type of things. And so if you refuse to talk about your politics and about your friends, you can face jail time. And you can be in prison for the full length of the grand jury, which is about 18 months. And there's a lot of this going on in the Pacific Northwest recently, targeting people who are perceived as anarchists. And again, now in New York, there's a guy named Jerry Koch who's in prison right now, in jail. for refusing to cooperate with the federal grand jury and refusing to talk about his activism and about his anarchist politics. So that's a very long way of saying, I think the way that it fits into it right now is it's part intimidation tactic and part what I would call social mapping. It's about getting bits of information wherever they can to try to piece together prosecutions. So the information that's obtained in a grand jury, it may be nothing. I mean, I won't use you and pick on you. What if I get called before a grand jury and I say, well, I remember so-and-so, we met at this event, and that's all it is. That may seem innocuous enough, but then that leads to an open investigation on you and you being in the front row here. You see what I mean? It goes on from there. And meanwhile, if you don't cooperate, you face jail time. If you do cooperate, but you don't say anything, it still causes problems because no one knows. I mean, are you all going to believe me when I go into the grand jury room and I say, well, I didn't offer information? There's no proof. It's secret. You see what I mean? It's kind of that fostering distrust.
This sort of, as you're going along, I'm thinking about how the police forces throughout the country have been, and how the potential for making some of us or a lot of us seem like terrorists are negative, and we are somehow in cahoots to do that. It just seems like there's something that's telling these police officers that it's okay to be more brutal, to less accepting of many things that go on, or the way their cities are acting, like with Occupy, where they started fencing people into small places, scaring them, intimidating them, arresting them. I mean, it just all seems like it's a ball of wax, that this idea that the people in general are a threat.
I completely agree. I mean, I think they're kind of different sides of the same issues and tactics that are going on. I mean, at the same time, you have this militarization of the police that are taking cues from the military, buying tanks, armor, all that kind of stuff. It's sending a message to people to think twice about protesting, but then at the same time, there's very clear messages being sent that if you choose other ways of being active, that you're going to be persecuted for that as well. I would argue that it's kind of hard to explain this dynamic as it's operated. I think part of it is instructions from top levels of law enforcement. We've seen evidence of that. Part of it is personal incentive. I mean, there is a career model in terrorism now that's been developed. One FBI agent I interviewed said, well, in the 80s it was the war on drugs, in the 90s it was gangs. Now it's terrorism. If you want to be successful, if you want to get ahead, you got to show you're making progress on this issue, right? So there's that. And I think a little bit more theoretical answer, but I think a really important one is kind of the nature of power, the nature of police, that when we give them this authority, across the board, they seem incredibly eager to seize upon it and to get more about it. So I mean, in a lot of ways, what I'm putting forward, I don't see it as a left or liberal critique. I mean, in many ways, that's a very conservative argument, that when you give people power, they use that power. And when you give the government more power, it uses that power. When you give police more guns and toys, they use those toys and guns. And I think that's what we're seeing right now. So it's hard to say what one is the most important. I think it's all just kind of mixing together, like you said, and it's just feeding on itself.
Can you talk a little bit about the origin of the Enterprise Terrorism Act, especially because I know that ALEC is meeting in DC this week, and one of its main bills is this resolution against country of origin labeling on media, so more.
Sure. The question was about the origin of the ALEC and the Ag-Gag bills and the Enterprise Terrorism Act. Do you all know ALEC? Have you heard of this group before? That's kind of sort of. So the quick summary, if you don't, it's a corporate front group where corporations pay tens of thousands of dollars to be members, and they attend these conferences in which state lawmakers are also there, and the state lawmakers go off and go to Broadway shows and fancy dinners and have fun, and meanwhile the corporate reps draft new laws. literally. And then the state lawmakers take them home and introduce them and say, hey, we have this brand new bill that I'm really passionate about called the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. They introduce it and people have no idea that it actually came from corporations. Now, the federal law, that all happens at the state level. And the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act is obviously a federal law. But there is a lot of overlap between the two. And in my work, I tried to chart kind of the legislative history of all of this. And I think, back in the 80s is when these legislative attempts began. Then they began at the state level. And then it kind of moved on to the federal level, and they started introducing laws against, making property destruction terrorism, or making it illegal to leaflet to kids at schools. All these attempts were made. And they got some progress, they got a couple laws passed, and then it went back to the states. And then ALEC came around in about 2003 with this model bill about animal and ecological terrorism. And it was really just a grab bag. I mean, it was everything they wanted. And these ALEC bills don't always get introduced in full. Most of the time they don't. But it's a wish list. So it had prohibitions against the filming of factory farms. It created a sex offender registry of protesters called an eco-terrorist watch list. It had prohibitions against civil disobedience as elevated crimes, all this kind of stuff. And I think that was really kind of a structural framework that these groups took to move forward. And I would argue these Ag-Gag bills are an outgrowth from that. I mean, there's direct coordination between all the ALEC members that we know of and these Ag-Gag laws. They're on all the same committees. I mean, they have ties to the industry as well. So I think that's kind of the short explanation to it. Now, I mean, I think there's a real risk of not only new ALEC laws being introduced at the state level, but with these groups not making the progress they want with the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, I think it's only a matter of time before new attempts are introduced to modify that too. Sure.
Okay, so I know that in several states they have passed Ag-Gag laws, and I know that recently they actually lost a couple where they tried to get them through. Can you talk about the tactics that the opponents have used against these laws and why they've been successful in actually not passing?
Sure. So these Ag-Gag bills, a couple of years ago, they were introduced in 10 states and they passed in 3, in Iowa, Utah, and Missouri. And there already were versions of this on the books in a few more states dating back to the 80s. Last year, they were introduced in about 11 states, 11 or 12, and defeated in all of them. And I think the difference was the groups that were being targeted started fighting back. And they started, the headlines like the ones I mentioned, using the power of this information and emphasizing to people that these corporations are trying to keep the public in the dark. This is really an issue about accountability, about transparency. It doesn't matter how you feel about animal rights or if you're vegan or not. This is an issue that affects everybody. And it was incredibly successful. And I think that's what helped, that type of framing is what helped bring a lot of these organizations together.
So is it some of the larger groups that have been fighting it, that have brought resources to it, like Meat Study, or? Yeah,
the Humane Society has been active at the state level, lobbying and defeating some of these bills, like in California especially. In Tennessee, where there's a governor veto, which was a pretty amazing victory that's really rare. Also groups like Mercy for Animals. The Animal Legal Defense Fund has a lawsuit now challenging Ag-Gag in Utah, the first lawsuit of its kind. I'm one of the plaintiffs in that, so that's another avenue that's being pursued. The ASPCA, the Sierra Club, Greenpeace, they've all lent support in a variety of ways, but I think some of the most important players have been really the Humane Society.
Can I ask one more?
Sure, of course.
Do you think there's anything that can be done about the actual overarching federal law?
That's a tough question because, it's really difficult. The nature of Washington is that even before something's passed, like when something is introduced, the votes are already tallied and they shape their tactics accordingly, and after it's passed, it's already forgotten about. It's either claimed as a victory or a defeat, but nobody wants to do that. They just move forward. So it's really hard to shift the dialogue backwards. Right, unless you're trying to give health care to poor people, in which we clearly have to like shut down the government. But for civil liberties, whatever. So the issue now is, I mean, some progress is being made. There's attempts to work within like the American Bar Association. There's a resolution that's coming up any time now, considering the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act and calling for a repeal. And there's some groups that are really active on this. One is called the Equal Justice Alliance. The ACLU is getting more interested. So, I mean, it's clearly where you have to go. I'm cautious because, even if that's repealed, there's going to be other attempts. And I don't mean to present this in kind of a fatalist way. I just mean to view all of this more holistically. So we have to educate about these tactics across the board. Whether or not the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act is on the books, there are going to be other things coming down the pike. And so to me, it's really important to shut those down and kind of build a foundation. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm thinking back, about a decade ago when we had the beginnings of the war on terror, and the Pentagon investigated something like 1,500 peace groups, activist groups, sort of the beginning of the criminalization of dissent. And I wonder how you relate that kind of activity and so forth to what you're fighting today. Is that part of the same cause, the criminalizing of dissent?
Absolutely. And in fact, I would argue that I think we kind of view all of this culturally as having, a start and a finish. I mean, this is the kind of mythology we often create about these issues, is that the Red Scare started, the Red Scare ended. The, COINTELPRO during the 60s started and ended in the 70s with the Church Commission. And I think that's how we often talk about this. And I would argue, though, that this type of repression is really a constant, and it fluctuates based on the growth of social movements, how effective these groups are, but it's always there. And so, for instance, after September 11th, it certainly shot up quite a bit because there's this new climate of fear that could be exploited. But, I mean, these were tactics that were being used for a very long time against peace groups, anti-war groups, certainly against animal rights and environmentalists since the 80s. So I think it's important to remember that 9/11 kind of opened more doors of opportunity, but it's not really something that was the start of this, kind of as you indicated. This has been going on for quite some time.
So, in my mind, oftentimes there's a real cognitive dissonance that comes on when I think about capitalist philosophy and environmental and animal concerns. And so my question to you would be, is there a future where a capitalist economic structure can sustain while also meeting the goals of environmental and animal welfare considerations?
No.
That's the answer.
I say that because, it's not something I usually, obviously my work is, I'm just kind of opining about my own, using my soapbox here, but my work is focused on very different issues. But I think what I've learned through my work is that part of the threat of these movements are the ones who refuse to be co-opted into that. So everyone's talking about going green right now, right? Everyone cares about animal issues. Everyone, I feel like I get run off the road by Hummers with environmental stickers. It's just like this caricature of itself, right? And I think there's a real push to emphasize that, it's okay to go green. We all love going green. We all love animals. Here's the right way to do it. And the right way is just buying more shit, right? It's buying whatever it is that's being put forward. That's the solution. And the people I'm talking about are ones, not just, the Earth Liberation Front, but above ground groups, the ones who are pushing past that critique and saying that's not enough. Yeah, we need to change what we're buying, but we also need to change the kind of structures that enable this. And those are the people that are on the front lines facing these tactics. So I answered no, because I think that's kind of an inherent characteristic of capitalism, that it's a system that's meant to be, it's meant to operate, to defend power, to defend the pursuit of profit against all others. That's the mission, that's the purpose, that's what corporations by law have to do. And I don't think we should be surprised when that's what they do. Now, I always hesitate to answer questions like this because I don't mean to say that there aren't avenues for resistance everywhere. I mean, if there's one thing I've learned in my work is how, not unstable, but how I lack sure footing in determining what tactics are the right one. Because, I mean, all of these things are being viewed as a threat in their own unique ways. So I think there are opportunities for resistance and change within these structures and also outside of them too.
If I could just ask.
Sure.
Well, you actually already referred to it. My follow-up was going to be, how do you see the commodification of the green movement inhibiting true growth within, environmental and animal activist groups?
I think the biggest danger of it is it's speaking to something that we all want to be true. I think we all want, one, to feel like we are good people and we're doing good things. And I think we all want to know that it's going to be okay. And I think the purpose of those kind of greenwashing campaigns is to say both of those things. That you're a good person by just doing X, Y, or Z, whatever minimal effort, and that we're going to be fine. And, I'm not going to tell you, oh, you're not good people. We're all trying to do the best what we can, right? But the second part, we really don't know that right now. I mean, the ecological crisis we're facing, those types of superficial solutions just aren't going to cut it. That's not a radical critique anymore. That's coming from the most mainstream sectors right now, that we have to go beyond it. So I think the temptation is, to fall into that trap, and it takes a lot of courage in a lot of ways to face that and to move beyond it, knowing that we don't have the answers, we don't know what the solutions are, and even just kind of allowing all of that, those thoughts into ourselves is really dark. To be honest, right? It's like I don't know what to do. The reason I'm doing this is because I didn't know what else to do. I was seeing people I care about go to prison. And that's why I'm here. If I had found another option, I would have done it. And I think we're all searching for that right now. Sure.
I have a question regarding the media. I got active because I was on television a few times. It was just a freak actor. And then, as things evolved over time, the story got around, and I think it did influence the situation we had in the state. So what happened was I had a dog that was killed in a trap. And I went to the media, the local media, and it got on the southern half of the state, it got around. And then it got around in newspapers, mainstream newspapers. Well, 2 years later, trapping people sent around something in Associated Press all over the nation saying that we got dog-proof traps to protect their industry. And what it reminded me of is a long time ago, someone in Wisconsin on Food Inc., if you ever saw that movie, it was in Wisconsin that her kid got killed by a hamburger with some horrible disease. And she's kind of in a similar situation. She's a victim of an industry, and then they tried to shut her up, and they shut Oprah up. And I thought, I get the way it operates, To me, the trapping industry is no different than any other big industry, but people are unaware of it, very unaware of it, how big it really is. And I thought, now what am I going to do? How could I fight the fact that they got that all over the United States, and then people come up to me and they say, wow, you did some great work. I saw they have dog-proof traps. And it's not, but they're believing this. It's almost like the way they said, oh, smoking won't kill you for a long time. Sure. And I thought, I really don't know what to do now. And seeing as how you're a media person, just wondered what you'd comment. And I wouldn't know where to start with that, really.
I as a journalist, so much of my work is just about education. I think even without knowing specific ways of fighting a lot of these tactics, I think that has to be the foundation, and we've seen the power of that in the examples I talked about with the Ag-Gag laws in particular. And I think that power also exists with things like grand juries. That, I mean, I've done a lot of interviews on like, pretty mainstream radio and TV stations about some of the grand jury issues, and people just have no idea this is taking place. And they're extremely sympathetic to someone who's taking a principled stand for their beliefs and for their community and what they're involved in. I think there's a lot of power in that. I think it's normal to be very wary of the press, and especially when it comes to social movements. But increasingly I've seen as activists and groups are willing to take their issue and present it in a way that more general public can understand, it's been incredibly successful. And I think the reaction of groups like that is a sign. They're trying to do the same thing. They're trying to turn that language around immediately and make everyone feel that they don't have anything to worry about.
I'm wondering about the interactions between the green movement, as you've been framing it, and the anti-choice movement. I'm hesitating to use the words pro-life, but that movement that is trying to stifle information about contraception and perhaps abortion clinics, for lack of a better term, and all of that. I'm wondering, both have been considered domestic terrorists in some context by some individuals. And I'm just wondering, is there some internal strife as there are members of both groups within the Green Movement? And I'm just wondering if you can relate those two movements. They're both important movements in some senses in the way we're thinking about preserving life.
I mean, I really haven't seen much interaction between the two at all. I think overwhelmingly within the environmental and animal rights movements, people are not in that camp at all. I think I would say way over 98%, even higher, are not sympathetic to that. And certainly when we're talking about the government's focus, I mean, it's been on animal rights and environmental groups and not on the anti-abortion groups whatsoever. And I think part of the reason is that issues like that, I would kind of make a theoretical argument that they're really representing kind of a more radical representation of fairly status quo values. So I would argue the reason like groups like the KKK or Aryan Nations or, Timothy McVeigh, Eric Rudolph are not being labeled as terrorists is that the values that they represent are pretty dominant values, but they're manifested in an extreme way. Like you're not going to see members of Congress, for the most part, openly support murdering abortion providers or, things like that. But it's very clear through state, federal, and local policies that there's this war on women, as the media campaign has been called, that's evident everywhere. So meanwhile, these animal rights and environmental groups, their values are in direct contrast to all those kind of status quo values. And I think that cultural explanation is a big part of why that dichotomy exists. There's this cultural war that's taking place.
Meetings like this, never once seen a recognizable face from a local electronic media, ever, in the audience, not once, ever. Is there anybody here from a local television station? Who's on the air? Who is on the air? Not WIOD. Okay, that doesn't count. All right, I'm talking about the other one. And so I don't understand that, first place. It boggles my mind. There's no curiosity, or is there a pressure not to come or something like that? But the other thing was, at MIT, many years ago, there was a student or a group of students who started wearing these glasses or hats or something where they were literally recording everything they were doing during the day, kind of thing. And I'm thinking now, is it Moore's law that says that the amount of media storage multiplies like every 18 months or something like that? What happens if there are a lot of people, activists, and they're going to things which are definitely very peaceful, if they have that kind of an apparatus to record everything that you're seeing, and then not even record it on them, but broadcast to places of their choice, maybe even places they don't know, but out into cyberspace. So it's there, it's recorded. There's no question about what happens. The police say, well, they were starting a riot, something was going on like this. There's no question. There's all kinds of evidence, and it's everywhere. And so I was wondering, do you think that might be a way for, things to progress a little bit in the future, so you have that kind of thing. So because otherwise, if you can do that, it's getting to the point where our eyes are becoming illegal, like that woman who was filming from a public site. Are our eyes soon going to be illegal?
Well, and there are attempts consistently that pop up to try to make it illegal to record the police. I mean, this is extending to other avenues as well. And, I think it's really important. I mean, people have learned at protests to be able to document what's taking place because more often than not, it could be really important in criminal cases. I don't think it's, for instance, I was just did events in Spain. The book was translated, and on the day I arrived, a new law was introduced that criminalizes a wide range of new activities. So advertising unpermitted protest on social media, doing banner drops like Greenpeace does. All this purely lawful activity is outright being criminalized. And just something I had no idea was actually taking place at that scope. And I reference that because I think when activists become effective, no matter what those tactics are, we should expect those tactics to be met with a kind of a backlash. So I think there are some great ideas in what you said, but I kind of view all of these tactics with the understanding that we can't put all our vegan eggs in one basket, so to speak, that any emphasis on one tactic too much, I think puts a disproportionate crackdown on it as well. Just something to think about. Maybe in the back, and then.
I think that's a great philosophical question. I don't really have a great answer to it, but I think it's something we need to ponder. Which is worse, criminalizing something or marginalizing something?
Well, I think it's really interrelated concepts. During the Red Scare, both were taking place simultaneously, but that criminalization led to, in a lot of ways, the dismantling of the modern labor movement that had widespread public support at the time, and the marginalizing of those values. They just go back and forth so often. I think we're seeing the same thing today as well.
On Sunday, from noon to 5 at the Wilmar Center, we've got this big free school event. We've got a bunch of different classes, and part of it is an ongoing discussion group. Thursdays, 6:30 at the info shop, Art of War for activists, and applying Art of War to different protests or general strikes, and hopefully also using it to plan and move forward with some actions.
Thanks for advertising. I hope everyone checks out and supports the info shop, and also the groups involved in events like this on campus, because not only it supports that community in town, but also allows people like me to do my work, and it's really important to keep these issues going, so I hope everyone supports them.
Talked about legal above ground activities, but you didn't talk a lot about some of what happened at UCLA, for example, where one of my colleagues' cars was firebombed, where another colleague had a Molotov cocktail at a neighbor's house, and activities that have not resulted in a human being injured right now, but are clearly meant to threaten and frighten people, including the home protests that occur very frequently at colleagues' houses at UCLA and Florida and other places. What are your views about that? And do you find those acceptable, or how do you think the community should respond to that?
I think it's really telling that, for instance, during the hearing on the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, Michelle Basso from Wisconsin testified, and her testimony wasn't focused on any of those things. It was about attempts in town. I actually don't know if this place was ever built to build a museum for primates used in animal experimentation, and also people that were protesting in her neighborhood, and she had received unwanted magazine subscriptions. So although crimes like that have obviously taken place, I think they've been used to take such a spotlight as representative of this entire movement that I think is really disingenuous. I mean, I think those tactics are incredibly dangerous. A lot of them were very suspicious to me in California, personally, that there weren't any claims of responsibility by any of the underground groups that were involved. But there have been claims of responsibility by groups like the revolutionary cells and animal liberation groups and things like that. You know, I think it's really caused a lot of internal problems like this fracturing that I was talking about, because I think the vast majority of the movement doesn't support things like that at all. And it's tempting to want to go on the offensive and condemn them as being responsible for these heavy-handed tactics. But I think the argument I'm putting forward is that those tactics are really being used as a kind of a shield or a front to push an agenda that's attacking the entire movement itself. For instance, with these attempts to criminalize open records requests and to prohibit them, criminalizing undercover investigators. The tactics that were in some ways popping up in the late 90s, early 2000s, don't really happen anymore. And we're not seeing this around the country. We're not seeing fire bombings. We're not seeing arsons by the Earth Liberation Front and Animal Liberation Front. There have been some mink releases out in here in Wisconsin and out west. For the most part, I think the movements have evolved quite a bit. And the groups that are being targeted, though, have nothing to do with that.
What did you thought about home protests, though, where there are many chanting individuals chanting things about death, clearly intending to frighten the occupants of the home or their children?
You know, I would disagree with that statement of clearly intending to frighten. I mean, I've interviewed a lot of people who've been involved in protests like that, and there've also been a lot of sociological research about the people who are engaging in this activity. And it's not intention to frighten. I mean, it's intention to put pressure on people in a way that they will actually care about it. As yelling at empty buildings or office buildings downtown, no one pays attention. But if you have a protest outside of someone's home, they have to care. And that's a lot of the reason why labor unions have used the exact same tactic. People protesting foreclosures and people being evicted out of their homes by the banks have had home protests at CEOs' homes. I mean, this isn't something that's isolated to the animal rights movement. But when it's happened with the animal rights movement, it's being used as, you know, this is all about instilling fear, but at the same time, it's okay when labor activists do it, or it's okay when people protesting foreclosures do it. Is anyone familiar with this terminal grand juries? Heard a little bit. There are some that went on in Wisconsin back in the 90s, a few that are going on right now. Grand juries are, kind of the quick summary is, they're meant to be, in theory, a safeguard during prosecution, so that before a prosecution moves forward, a grand jury and panel of citizens evaluates evidence brought by the government to determine if there's enough to go forward with it. Now, when it comes to political cases, since the 60s and certainly since the Red Scare as well, grand juries have been used to investigate, surveil, and harass social movements. And the reason they're used in that way is that when you're called before a grand jury, you're going to a room that's secretive. You can't even have your attorney present. You have no First and Fourth and Fifth Amendment rights. If you're being asked questions, you have to answer them. And these questions are about, what do you believe? What do you know about this Will Potter guy who came to Madison? What do you know about Josh and everybody else here on campus? What do you think about that? What do you think?
Yes, I'm wondering if the Obama administration is better than the Bush administration in some of these areas. I'm thinking, for example, of Michelle Obama, who is supposed to be interested in organic farming and healthful living. If you see any glimmers of hope in ways we can reach the Obama administration.
That's a great question. I mean, Obama, as a senator, made some really important comments about all of this. I mean, he objected to one of these Senate hearings on eco-terrorism, saying it was diverting law enforcement resources and instilling fear. A lot of the same talking points, that I'm using this evening. Unfortunately, since he's taken office, we haven't seen any action on any of that. One of the communications management units is in his home state of Illinois. The first prosecutions under the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act were under his watch. Of course, we're seeing everything with the NSA spying and the war on Edward Snowden and WikiLeaks, and the list goes on and on. But, I like that emphatic but at the end of it. I think there is about the Animal Liberation Front, all these type of things. And so if you refuse to talk about your politics and about your friends, you can face jail time. And you can be in prison for the full length of the grand jury, which is about 18 months. And there's a lot of this going on in the Pacific Northwest recently, targeting people who are perceived as anarchists. And again, now in New York, there's a guy named Jerry Koch who's in prison right now, in jail, for refusing to cooperate with the federal grand jury and refusing to talk about his activism and about his anarchist politics. So that's a very long way of saying, I think the way that it fits into it right now is it's part intimidation tactic and part what I would call social mapping. It's about getting bits of information wherever they can to try to piece together prosecutions. So the information that's obtained in a grand jury, it may be nothing. I mean, I won't use you and pick on you. What if I get called before a grand jury and I say, well, I remember so-and-so, we met at this event, and that's all it is. That may seem innocuous enough, but then that leads to an open investigation on you. I really shy away from using the word hope, but I think there's an incredible amount of potential to see what's taking place right now around the country. Even in that climate, there's a lot of incredible organizing going on. There's been a resurgence of the grassroots environmental movement, some really ambitious new ways of doing animal rights activism. There's been a focus on surveillance and ideas of transparency and secrecy like never before. So I see a lot of potential and hope in that. Perhaps not so much with people in power.
You may have been the only senator to vote against the Patriot Act. I was wondering if he voted against the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, or if you know if Tammy Baldwin, who's our local, was our local congressperson at that time, voted against, she's now a senator, or Cole, who was our senator.
The short answer to that is no, they didn't. The more complicated answer is that on the Senate side it passed by a voice vote, so technically no one opposed it. On the House side it passed through a procedure called suspension of the rules, which is kind of an obscure procedure that's used for non-controversial bills. For instance, that same week it was used to honor the guy who renamed a bridge, to rename a bridge in Delaware after the guy who invented the Roth IRA, and to honor the St. Louis Cardinals and some other sports teams. I mean, that's how this is supposed to be. So these bills are kind of coming down a conveyor belt, and you're just passing them super fast to get them out the door. Well, members on the House side found out that there was growing opposition to this law, so they used that procedure to pass a terrorism law. And there was technically no voice vote. I mean, there were only 6 members of Congress in the room at that time. No one spoke out. I mean, Dennis Kucinich raised some objections, but people often say he's the person who voted against it, and that's not true. Technically, no one did, because there wasn't a vote. I mean, it passed by unanimous consent under suspension of the rules. So not to offer too much explanation of that, but in other words, no one in Congress spoke out against this.